Oh, apologies there, everyone. I think I left myself muted. I just wanted to say welcome, everyone. I hope you're having a great morning. Or if anybody's seeing any of the recordings, I hope you're having a great day. So I just want to quickly introduce myself. My name's Mathew Payne, or at Geekmasher. I'm a field security architect here at GitHub. My background is primarily focused at security-focused role, but over the past few years, I have migrated more into developer and security-focused, and that's why I moved here to GitHub. With me, I have my moderators as well with me, and today we'll be talking about DevSecOps and working together seamlessly between developers and security. Because a lot of the time, this is a very, very complicated process. A lot of organizations really struggle with this from day to day. As a personal story, like I've worked with a lot of different organizations with different maturities. They've gone from all sorts of backgrounds, but for example, the most common I've seen a lot of the time is where developers are left to their own devices. Security teams kind of come knocking on the door every 6 to 12 months, maybe ask for a penetration test to be done or some black box test of their software. The security team comes in a bit more like a cowboy as such, and then sit in their ivory tower and say, oh, your software is not very good or insecure. And we really want to change this, especially at GitHub, because we're the home of all open source software. So that's what this talk is about. And thankfully, this won't be death by PowerPoint. There's just a couple of slides as introduction, and then we'll get right into the demo. So one frequently asked question I get a lot of the time is, what is DevSecOps? And this can vary between people to people about what this means, but in essence, it's all about cultivating a culture where you and you as developers, as operation team, and security are working seamlessly together, having shared responsibility for your security, making sure that it's a collaborative environment, make sure it's works. You can talk to each other about security issues, and then also one of the primary things that we'll be talking about today is automation. And one of the questions I get is, so Mathew, what is the difference between DevSecOps and DevOps? And in a lot of cases, this is almost the exact same thing, just more of a focus on security. So if you're already doing DevOps, and you just can start adding, for example, some security tooling in there and maybe changing some of your processes to include the security team reaching out to the developer team and start cultivating that culture, you're going to start developing a DevSecOps environment. As I said, today we'll be focusing on the automation part of things, primarily enabling developers and embedding security into your workflows, and in particular, using GitHub Advanced Security and CodeQL to achieve this as well. That said, let's dive straight into the demonstration here. So a few of you might have already seen this in the past before, but I'm going to kind of go over this for anybody that's new that hasn't seen this before. I've created a public repository right now because now GitHub Advanced Security has now gone general availability, and it's free for all public repositories to use. You can also follow along and set this up yourself at a later date as well. I've picked this this project. It's an OWASP project. It's a Node.js application with an Angular front end. It's kind of my go-to for checking and looking at security issues for JavaScript. And one of the things that I've already done, but we'll kind of go through this process, is actually setting up GitHub Advanced Security. Now, this in my opinion, a lot of pain points when it comes to adding security tools into CI pipelines is primarily around the adoption of that tool. And that's one of the things that's really important. It should be as simple as adding a linter into your pipeline or enabling your unit tests in a pipeline. It should be as easy as that to add security in. So that's what we've strived for at GitHub. So one of the things you can do is all projects will have this security tab. This will be this might also be available prior to you in enabling it. And you've got a lot of different security tools that are built into the platform here. The one we'll be focusing on today is actually like the code scanning element of this, which is powered by CodeQL, which is the tool that we acquired via a company called Semel last year. So to set this up from a blank repository, you'll actually get this screen. This allows you to set up workflows in actions to automatically run CodeQL, which is the analysis engine, on your repository. We've also created a platform where you can have seamless integration with open source and other commercial tools as well, as you can see here. Today, I'm going to focus on CodeQL. So when you click set up for your code scanning, you'll be presented with an actions workflow. And if anybody's not familiar with actions, you can essentially set up a pipeline. You can automatically run various tools that you require for a particular workflow. In this case, what we've done, I think the most important parts to notice is, first of all, when this action is run upon, one of the most important features of any code scanning tool is actually to integrate seamlessly into developer workflows. And one of the important things is that, for example, you're making sure that when on the creation of pull requests, any branches that you want to protect any vulnerable code from being merged into, you want to be protecting this. So it could be your master branch, your main branch, your develop branches, your release branches, whatever works for your organization. This is where it gets set up.
Mathew,
the other thing
it might be beneficial to make the screen the size a bit bigger. The font
apologies. Let me make this. Oh, okay. Sorry. Thanks, Peter. So here as well, one of the other things that's really useful is also taking a look at the scheduler. And we'll kind of talk about scheduling this as a cron job, and we'll talk about it in a little bit. But primarily for a lot of older code bases in particular, you may not be actively developing upon this, but you still want the benefit of automatically running those security updates on your main or master branches automatically, even if there hasn't been any commits for the past X days as well. And a lot of this other features I won't go over too much, but the primary ones that we'll focus at is actually the CodeQL initialization method or action. This essentially is the part that initializes CodeQL for scanning purposes, with a few properties that can be set. There's also an automatic build for any compiled languages. As JavaScript isn't a compiled language, we won't be using this. And then finally, the analysis part. So this is the part where the engine will run across the database and generate us results. Now, I've already done this, so I'm not going to commit this. But let me just quickly check the chat before I continue this. Okay, awesome. Thank you, Peter, for responding there. So I've added this last night. I added it. I've removed some of the comments just to make it a bit cleaner. But it's practically the exact same. When this actually run an action in my workflow. So you can see here I added a code scanning. This run through its analysis. This is around 4 minutes long. This does vary from code base to code base size. But essentially what it does is runs through the various processes that the tool CodeQL needs to analyze the code base. one of the things to note is you can see what queries are used and other properties that are set as well, which is quite useful, and we'll come up towards that a little bit in the future as well, and some other properties. And then the part that typically takes the longest is the analysis part. This is the part where it analyzes the code itself and then runs the queries on it. So once this action has run, it will then produce this SAR file, which you can see here was produced in my pipeline. This SAR file is then uploaded to GitHub to be displayed in the security tab. This is the same integration workflow as the other tools that I mentioned, third-party tools as well. Once that file has been uploaded, it will be processed by GitHub, and it will be rendered in your security tab in your CodeQL alerts as well. So you can kind of see here, there's a lot of rate limiting issues here. We have a couple of cross-site scripting attacks. We have some NoSQL issues as well. And this is really important to kind of get this content in front of developers as soon as possible as well. And you do notice as well, I do also have 110 issues present in here. What you can also do is actually filter by this. So one of the things that I like to just quickly look at is the XSS issues. One of the issues that I'll be taking a look at is, let's take an example here. And we can see here, we can see where the security vulnerability is introduced and where the sink is. And if anybody's not familiar with what a sink is, for all static code analysis tools, you need a few main elements, but the two core ones are what's called the source, which is the origin of the input, most of the time user defined. In other cases, it may not be, and primarily the sink. So on what method does the issue occur, and make the vulnerability vulnerable. You can it will be displayed in GitHub very nicely, showing you exactly where the sink is. So you can see here, I have my string here where maybe I've got an issue that I need to respond to the user with, and this is a 500 as the status code, and then I'm sending back a string, which is essentially this prefix string with actually the contents of this query in here. So from here, this isn't escaped, this isn't encoded, and you as a developer may not be familiar with a security issue, especially junior developers coming out of university or self-learning, may not know about cross-site scripting, for example. So one of the things that we've done as well is provided documentation so that developers can understand quickly what the security issue is, and then look at what the recommendations are for doing this, and some example snippets of code to actually resolve this issue. One of the other things that we find very useful as well is to share content and resources about this as well. If any of you are not familiar with the OWASP or the Open Web Application Security Project, I highly recommend you take a look at it, and you can see what kind of content there and security issues you may find as well. So one of the things I didn't share before, but I will share it just here for a second, is the paths. So a lot of the time this may not be needed, but one of the things that's super useful is for developers to see, okay, where does the origin of this user input come from, and where does it occur? Now you can imagine that this starts getting really complicated with very complex projects and applications, but in this case, it's relatively simple. The input is on the same line, and that's the sink is as well. So this is really awesome, but we want to take it a step further. Scanning your master or main branch is great and all, but if developers don't look at these results, then it's not that useful. So what we kind of discussed in the actions workflow is actually the integration into your pull requests here. Now, one of the things that's really nice about this, you can see here, last night I just created a sample for this. We actually created a new feature. In this case, let me just skip to my VS Code. Drop down in second. Let's drop down into here. I actually created a new advanced search initial function in JavaScript in Node. So I'm just taking, I have a root, I'm just calling, have my function here that does the, when it's invoked, it will run. Actually, it's the exact same as here, but of course, this is just the initial one, but maybe I want some of the team to add some machine learning or something in here to entice people using the advanced search features. And you can see here, it's a very similar vulnerability to the one we saw earlier. What then I did was go through a typical developer workflow where you have your separate branch, in this case, my feature advanced search. I then want to push this up to my remote repository. Maybe after some iterations, I want to then create a pull request, so maybe it gets merged into develop for some QA testing, or maybe I want to merge it into master because it's a finished feature and we want to push it to production. One of the really nice things is, of course, most developers use CI pipelines to make sure that the app can deploy correctly. There's no breaking of any unit tests. If you have any linter requirements, those are run as well to make sure your code quality is up to scratch. All these kinds of things are run instantaneously, and security should be done at the same time as well. This is really important. And the reason why we focused primarily at the pull request level is that we want to make sure that users, developers don't introduce new security issues. In a lot of studies that we've done, one of the things that we've seen is that developers, when they see a vulnerability or see a breaking of their pipelines in a feature in a pull request or a feature, you get that instantaneous feedback, and you go through your review process and things like this. You're more likely to fix it at this level and just not force a merge in this case. Of course, you go through a typical developer review process, but maybe if there's things that come up in your static code analysis issues, maybe it's time to start adding some of those security people in there. Maybe especially if there's a security vulnerability that comes up and you're maybe not familiar with how that vulnerability is actually exploitable in this as well. One of the really nice features about this is that it will fail your pipeline. When this is done, you can actually go into the details about exactly what this is. In this instance, we have one new alert, which is an error. And this will show us our cross-site scripting attack. And you can go into the similar view as we showed before. This is a different line number though, and a different branch, but it has the same similar details as well. So this is really powerful for a developer to see those changes and see those issues occur. One of the other nice features that I find is actually like super intuitive, and this was actually done prior to any security elements in this, was being able to look into the delta or the changes that have been done in GitHub itself. The issue is natively being placed into the GitHub user interface. You can actually start conversations inside GitHub around security issues. So in this case, maybe I want to, maybe it's not auto prompting, but you could say, for example, let's start a conversation where I want to start a conversation with the developer around, hey, please fix this issue and contact me if you need to. And contact me if there are any issues. And you can start adding a lot of content in line with into GitHub. So for example, you can have conversations between the security team from the developer team if maybe it's an ops issue. So for example, if you're running a third-party infrastructure as code scanning tool and you want to quickly take a look at somebody's actually changing some configuration that maybe shouldn't be touched and maybe it's making it more insecure, you can actually get ops involved as well in this as well. I'll just start this and just comment, not approve. But you can kind of see the developer workflow here, and you can start having conversations with developers from a security side, but also from a developer side. Maybe this vulnerability is maybe not something that you know about, and maybe it's time to have a discussion with the security team about it as well. Let me see if there's any questions in the chat.
So Mathew, one of the questions that seems to be coming up is just sort of covering the coverage of languages that we support. Would you like to potentially dive into that for a bit?
Yeah. So I see a couple of questions around Unity and C# as well. So in the sense of supported languages, it's primarily focused at Java, C#, JavaScript and TypeScript, C++, Python, and at some point in the near future will be Ruby as well. These are the primary languages. For things like Unity, which primarily are more of a framework around in C#, there are native added framework support for that particular framework. But if that's something that's requested, we can always kind of like put it in our backlog of like frameworks to support and things like this as well. So this is really important. I saw as well, Peter's just shared the link to all of the supported languages. So you can take a look there and things like this as well. Will you be able to configure code scanning for the blockchain? So right now, for Hyperledger Fabric framework, it is, if it's written in JavaScript and there's nothing based off, no syntactical problems with the JavaScript itself, and it's very similar to native JavaScript, then there shouldn't be a problem with analyzing it. The issue that you'll have is that the framework itself, or I shouldn't say framework, but that version of the language may not support the associated sources and sinks that I mentioned before, that's core to static code analysis. So if you, for example, wanted to analyze that JavaScript code, you'd actually have to add support for that, those types of issues in that. But it is possible. The only time that it may not be possible is something like a semantical like change that needs to be addressed. Is there any other questions? I didn't see any questions, but feel free to keep on asking questions in the chat as well. So the next thing that I wanted to kind of cover was some more of the advanced features that I think is really, really important to start utilizing as well. Actually, before we do that, one of the things that I was going to do, but as an example here, is actually you could edit this fix, but I'll skip this for now, and if we have time at the end, we'll cover that as well. So what I've done is actually looked at these security issues here, and one of the things you may have all noticed, I've actually got a recurring issue that keeps on occurring here called missing rate limiting. If you actually take a look inside this particular issue, it's primarily because I don't have any middleware or anything in place in my Node application to limit the amount of requests coming into the application. Now this is great. As a bit of context, static code analysis primarily focuses at the code that is analyzing then and there. So in the grand scheme of things, maybe this application is actually running behind a load balancer or some gateway that is actually rate limiting it for you. A lot of cloud providers actually provide this support out of the box as well with some fine-grained detail. But there's two ways to handle this. You've got it where you can actually mass select a particular issue. So in this case, we can do missing rate limiting. You can see here we've actually got quite a lot of issues, because if you think about it, every route in my application that is present needs to potentially needs to be rate limited. Now, from a developer standpoint, you could do two things. One, mark everything as a false positive, resolve it as a false positive, or won't fix. And you can also do some talk about other other details as well about it. But one of the things that I kind of focus on is maybe you don't want these issues to reoccur again, because every time you add a new route, there'll be a new security alert. You have to then remove it, and it becomes a bit of a pain, especially for developers when you're trying to review a pull request and you've got maybe some other more pressing security issues that have been accidentally introduced. You don't want a few other new rate limiting issues in this. So what I've done is I've actually created a new configuration here. Let me just change branches so I can demo this. And what I've done is actually got almost a very similar workflow file to what I had in GitHub, but with a small change. The small change is actually one of the properties attached to the initialization method of, let me zoom in. I just realized it's very small. One of the features that I've actually done is added a configuration file for CodeQL. This can be relative in the path that you specify in your project. And this will essentially get loaded at runtime. When you go into here, there's actually quite a lot of different things you can do here. Now, the first thing to note is that you can specify a name, so you can have maybe multiple configuration files. The disable default queries. So this is actually one of the ways how CodeQL works is it bases all of its analysis off of what's called query suites. Query suites are a large collection of queries that are run at analysis time. So what we're saying is essentially, I don't want any of the default queries that have been enabled. And then I'm also pointing it to, as part of this queries, to this QLS file or the query language suite file. This allows me to actually specify a custom JavaScript suite in this case. And then I've also got some other paths here, like paths ignore, and then paths also is another variable that you can say, hey, I only want to scan a particular folder, for example. One of the things that I won't show, but I'll show you later, is actually there's a few public JavaScript files, for example, that are in here, like maybe to remove a bit of analysis time, I don't want to analyze the jQuery minified files and stuff. But for now, we kind of leave that out there. But you can imagine the more code you have, the longer analysis time this takes. It's similar for linters and other tools like that as well. So we'll ignore that for now. And then the other part was we were talking about a custom JavaScript suite, and this is actually defined as another file. If you go in here, let me just set that to YAML. And in here, there's a couple bits of detail as well in here. One of the primary ones is actually it specifies the context of like what query seats do I want to inherit from. So in this case, I'm actually inheriting a query suite called JavaScript Security and Quality. Now, what this is if you navigate to the CodeQL, if you navigate to the CodeQL publicly available repository, in this case, I kind of haven't talked about this, but we'll talk about it later, is that all the queries and suites are actually available in GitHub itself for anybody to view as well. You can actually select the query suites that are actually specified in the CodeQL repository. In this case, by default, all projects that haven't been configured actually use what's called the code scanning query suite. This one's just the JavaScript one, but you can imagine for all the different languages that are in that are supported, each one of them has a separate query suite. And this is the primary reason for there's different vulnerabilities in something like C++ to Java, for example, or JavaScript. And another thing that we kind of mentioned at the beginning about the importance about the sinks and sources is that Python has very different sinks to JavaScript sinks. So they're completely separated, just to make it clear as well. Let's quickly have a look at the chat. Okay. Excellent. Thank you, Peter, for answering all the questions in the chat. Awesome. So if we go back to, oh, wrong one. If we go back to our configuration here, we can actually see what query suite we're actually importing from. In this case, I actually just want to inherit the JavaScript security and quality. Now, this is actually a different one. So this is, I'm actually extending the default query suite. If you can imagine, the query suite that's built in by default is actually a very highly accurate query suites, where you can actually, we have a very low false positive rate, but you can start using some maybe more of the more experimental query suites as well. So you can start really using a lot of experimental features that might find something, but of course that might come at the cost of potentially speed and accuracy as well. So if a query is added that is very inaccurate, then you're going to get a lot of false positives. And then finally, in here as well, you can actually explicitly set the excludes. So what you can actually do is actually set the exact queries that you want to include or exclude or include as well. And I kind of will go over this in this because it's actually really, really useful. As you can see kind of some of these other examples in here. Let me zoom in. And for example, as an organization, you maybe want to only be focusing on particular things. So I've only, in my example here, I'm actually showing only the exclude. But one of the really powerful things is you can actually do the including feature as well. So instead of maybe a lot of security vulnerabilities that you maybe as an organization don't care about, you can actually create a query pack that only includes very high results that are security related. So a great example of this is, let's say you have a very old code base, maybe 10, 20 years old, and there's lots of security problems, but there's so much, a lot of technical debt and security debt around that project, and you're getting a lot of high, mediums, and lows. You'll get high, mediums, and like informationals. And you want to kind of like, as from a security perspective and from a developer's perspective, I want to reduce that to the ones that I can be almost not guaranteed, but to a degree of accuracy that the CodeQL team have decided of that query. So you can actually include specific queries and categories as well. So this can be very, very powerful for organizations or even at a single developer code base as well. In my instance, I'm actually just excluding this one query. The query can be found as part of this JavaScript project. One thing I forgot to do is actually push this and merge this, because this may take a few minutes. But if you can imagine that pipeline earlier took about 4 minutes, we're actually extending it massively, the amount of stuff that we're covering, and but we are excluding one. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to just quickly git push origin. What's this feature called? Sorry, branch. Okay, awesome. Git push origin. I forgot the name of this. That's fine. And we're going to just push this up. So this is for demo purposes, but forgive me, all the developers that are about to cringe at what I'm about to do. But for speed's sake, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just quickly merge this without reviewing it and assume that my feature is completely flawless. So let's just quickly create a pull request and then just immediately merge that before anything runs. But you can imagine you would actually want to run this before and make sure everything works before you merge it into your code. But I've kind of done that already. One thing to note is that I'm actually going to be, because that first push and that pull request, I'm actually running one of my actions in here as well. So for time's sake, I'm actually just pop over to the project that I prepared a little bit for this, but we'll wait for this to run. But one thing to note is if we go into here, into the adding code scanning part. So this is the one that I showed you earlier. We can actually go into the initialization and actually see all the queries that are run here. The other one that's really great. As you can see in here, I think it's the analysis. You can see it's 1 out of 64. So in this current analysis, we're actually running 64 queries on top of that that CodeQL database. And I don't know if I explained before, but CodeQL generates a database that it will run these queries on. And essentially these queries run against that database, which is a representation of the code that is in the project as well. So you can see here, there's 1 out of 64. And then if we go to my other project, just as a quick run into this one, this is a very similar project, but just somewhere else. Let's look at, I think not that one, this one. Just as like a jump into it, we'll go back to the other project in a second. But if we open up our perform code query analysis, you can actually see, okay, we've actually almost doubled the amount of queries that we'll be running. But if you look at a lot of the names of these queries and things like this, you'll actually discover that a lot of them are like, for example, code quality based issues as well. So a bit of history. The CodeQL team actually wrote this primarily as a code quality tool back in 2000 and early 2000s. Can't remember the year. And then it changed to more of a security focus, a lot like a lot of other tools in the static code analysis realm as well. And you can get a list here as well. But one of the things that's also a nice feature is you can actually, like in the Sarif file itself, because of the specifications of the file format, it actually contains a list of all those queries that are run as well. So an interesting project that Peter, my moderator, actually wrote a few weeks ago was actually a nice action to consume this and display as a PDF report what analysis queries will run on that code base and things like this. So once the analysis is run, okay, okay, this one's still running. How long has it got? Let's just quickly take a look at this. Wait for that to load. Okay, we're almost done. So let me take a look at the chat while I look at that.
So Matthew, at the moment, one of the questions is around sort of the concept of code coverage and how that relates to our database and the queries that we're running. Would you like to possibly expand on how we actually do that and how we might tie that into the coverage based on the queries that we provide?
So it depends what you mean by code coverage. So a lot of developers might say that the code coverage is, for example, what amount of code am I running all my unit tests on and things like this. Currently, we don't support anything like that. I don't think we have a plan to, but you can actually use like a lot of open source actions and software to actually do that for you for I see in the chat it was around C#. If it's more around the analysis itself, as in the framework supported and stuff like that, that's actually built into part of the queries as well. So the queries are extended per the frameworks that we do support, and then this is like added to any consequent next scans that were ever scanned. So for example, if a new .NET framework comes out, .NET Core or the .NET framework, was it 5 is going to be the new one in the next year or so. Once that is released, maybe there's some modifications and changes between the previous versions. We would have to then, our security team would add support for that. But of course, we get a little bit of advantage because in that case, actually .NET Core is open source, if I remember correctly, so we can actually see the previews of those changes before. So the team can then review that and then add in the queries as they see fit as well. Hopefully that answers
if it was a framework, you could also potentially extend that using your own queries. Is that true?
That is completely correct as well. So that's actually something we'll cover in a bit as well. So one of the really nice features around CodeQL is, first of all, it's open source, as in the queries are open source. This allows you to essentially I wouldn't recommend forking it, but at least maybe taking a look at the queries, the languages supported, and how the frameworks are supported as well. These can then be extended as well, as Peter rightly said, where developer teams can either extend them themselves, security researchers can extend them for developers as well, and either contribute back. So, for example, if a new framework comes out that's better than Express, for example, um, and um, and a lot of developers want added support for it, you could add the support for it yourselves and then contribute that back to the open source repository for these. Now, in some other organizations, it's very common to have your own frameworks and libraries that you want to use to do particular tasks. And in the case of that, if it isn't actually added as part of the code base, you can actually write an extended query set, a query pack that includes, for example, the analysis of those particular frameworks as well. So that it becomes a lot of extensibility as well. And we'll cover that in a bit as well. Right. Let's go back. Okay, it's still running. Let me just jump to the other project just so you can kind of see. So in this example, it's actually run and it's produced a lot more results in this case. But if you remember correctly, actually I enabled all the code quality and some of the other features as well. So that's why there's actually much more. But actually, if you go to the closed, you can see that actually all of the rate limiting issues have actually been automatically removed from this. And if you go into here and you search for not tag, a rule, missing, rate limiting, you can see there's no open issues. So you can kind of see the power of being able to configure this as your requirements. In particular for things that are maybe outside the context of this application. But you have to be very cautious, just as a side note, is that you could technically exclude all of the queries and then you'd have a clean bill of health, but actually you didn't run any of the analysis. So this is something to really take note of as well. And one of the other things I did mention earlier is actually it has discovered a few issues in, for example, the Angular minified version and stuff like this, but we typically exclude this and use something like Dependabot to actually analyze this as well. Let me just quickly see the chat. Okay, no new questions. Awesome. So one of the next things I wanted to kind of touch base on was actually extending the queries. So one of the really nice features about CodeQL is you can extend the queries with your own customizations per repository, or even having a third-party repository as well for this. So I'll just show you a sample of this snippet, but you can see that I actually created this folder called queries. In the query pack, sorry. No, not query pack. In here, sorry. In the CodeQL configuration file, I've actually set up a couple of additional steps. So before it didn't have these two lines, and I've done two things. One is I've actually added my own custom query that's as part of this repository. This needs to be defined in the repository. Make sure that the path is relative as well. And then the second thing we'll come across, we'll talk about in a second. The first thing I wanted to show was the queries folder. So this is actually built off two primary files. Both of these are called to define that this folder is a query pack. From here, anything contained inside this can be defined as a query. So in this instance, I've actually just specified the languages and some of the names and also dependencies. So for example, this is actually the core library for all the JavaScript stuff. If you didn't have this, for example, you can run some of the default behavior that the built-in queries have. And then actually, I've actually taken a sample of one of the experimental queries. This is actually to do with server-side template injection. This is quite a complicated query, so I'll jump over to another one that's a little bit easier to explain. But in this particular issue, what happens is when you're rendering particular templates using a templating engine, so like Pug or Jade or any of those other engines like this, there's actually a potential ability that if you pass in user-defined input into the string that's actually the template string, you can actually get arbitrary code execution in this. So as kind of like a quick view over it, just to see, just to get people to know a little bit more about the language itself. This is not going to be covering how to write CodeQL queries. Some of my colleagues, and I think I'll share it in the chat in a second, or Pete can, and they will much more better explain more about the queries and writing them from scratch and things like this. But you can kind of imagine that this essentially is looking for any imported modules called Jade or Pug, and from there it's actually looking for any members or method calls that are essentially calling the compiler renderer, and it's looking for the first argument. So if you can imagine you calling compile, you're passing in a string and you're concatenating some user input. That's very bad. You don't want that. And there's also some other frameworks supported here, so Dot and EJS as well, and Nunjux as well. And then just the base query for CodeQL as well. I won't go over this too much because this is a little bit more of a complicated one, but it's kind of like an interesting one to show you an example of. One of the other things I did show earlier, and I kind of skipped over it, was this line. This line actually allows you to specify a repository or a file inside a repository inside GitHub that contains a query pack and queries as well. So in this case, I've actually got my own repository called security queries. So if I go over to GitHub, I should have it here. I actually have a repository of my own custom queries that I uploaded a couple of them last night. In the case of this project, I've got one Java and one JavaScript. The Java code is actually just some experimenting I'm doing, and any queries that are built for other languages won't run on this as well. If you do have JavaScript and Java at the same time, like a lot of Spring apps have, then you can just utilize those as well. Let me just quickly see the chat if there's any questions. All good. Awesome. So in this case, I've actually created a query. Well, I didn't create this query. One of my colleagues created this query, and it's a lot easier to read. So this actually is a query that is not technically a secure. It is a security issue in some cases, but in older versions of Lodash, if any non-JavaScript developers are familiar with, Lodash is a utility library that's used for simplifying a lot of tasks for you. Really awesome. But issues primarily in the case of a particular one of its functions called template. There's actually there was a few I can't remember if it's months or years, but in a particular version there was actually a security vulnerability where you could get prototype pollution. I'm not going to go over the exact details about prototype pollution, but you can look it up on OWASP or in these other pages as well. And actually what you can do is you can kind of read this a lot easier than the other query that I talked about. In this case, we're actually creating a class just to make it so I can repeatedly use this method or a predicate inside here. I'm running just this function here to kind of get my dependencies. So for example, in that CoQL database that I spoke of, it actually also includes things like the node package data as well. So in the case of this, I'm actually looking for a package name that is equal to Lodash, and then also making sure that I'm actually looking for the exact version of that package. You can also see there's and statements between here. So it's kind of like a SQL plus object-oriented programming language. And then finally, I'm actually looking for any data, uh, any calls to the template method. Now, of course, in this example, I'm actually not doing a lot of the other things you should do. Like if this, for example, needs input from a user, then you may need to write a configuration for that to actually show the user that it's coming from one source to this particular sync in example. So that's kind of like a brief overview. Like this is a 10,000-foot view. If you want any more information, I'll share it in the chat once we've ended the live stream, or just before we end the live stream. So as an example, an organization could actually have a massive list of their own customizations they have on particular branches, particular teams. So maybe you have one application team versus another application team. Maybe they have their own queries that they want to run on it. This would actually be part of either their own separate repository, or it could be just another branch of the main repository that you want to run as well. So this actually took much longer, but let's take a look at the logs for my test environment here. So I did the exact same, where I actually just forced merged quickly just to kind of show you an example of this. But you can kind of see a couple of things in here. But one of the things is the initialization function. This is the important one. So we're seeing what we saw earlier around all the different queries that are loaded in at runtime. But actually, if you go down here, you can actually see that actually other libraries and queries are actually, I shouldn't say libraries, but query suites are loaded into this project. In the case of this is actually from the local project. You can see here it's from the local project, and it's that server-side template injection as well. And then if we go a little bit further down, you can actually see this is actually from my other repository, and you can see here it's actually automatically loaded that Lodash template. Now, one of the things you may have saw is I didn't specify the query. So here I'm actually specifying the query as part of a repository, but here I'm actually not. So any QL files that are contained in that repository actually automatically loaded as well. And you can kind of also see for Java projects, there's that I have a test server-side request forgery query that I've been tinkering with. And then once that analysis is done, you'll actually see the results of those two queries. Now, actually, before I continue, one of the interesting facts, and this server-side request, the server-side template injection query is actually kind of interesting, because the reason why this wasn't added to the production queries is that maybe there's some, you can see here, there's actually the runtime and compile time is actually a lot longer than a lot of the other ones, like 2 minutes versus like a few seconds for each one. So maybe the team have not fully written up the exact query that will run optimized on that on the CodeQL database. So this hopefully will be coming soon, but right now this is not as part of it. And you can imagine that a lot of organizations might have their own customizations that they want to add that may take a little bit longer than normal as well. And you can see also this Lodash template as well. Sadly, I actually didn't add samples of the template issue, but you can kind of see in this, you would see the issue based in here as well. So you can kind of see that immediately. And going forward, you'd also see these security issues come up in your pull requests as well. So if you added a query that checks for a particular use case, for example, a really good use case might be that you as an organization have something like a bug bounty program, where you're getting a lot of bug bounties coming in from external security researchers or testers or any of these other things, and you could codify that vulnerability. So for example, let's say you found a security issue that's very niche to your organization, you could actually go through the process of if you had a global security queries repository, and you could add it to there. All your repositories that actually use this library would then be consuming that query, and going forward, and also you would be able to detect as part of an organization like where those issues are. So you could potentially go tomorrow and say, okay, I write a query. We have a new vulnerability that's come out in Lodash. I want to check the version of it, and I also want to, for example, check if somebody's invoking this method with some user input, for example. Or let's say it's in a Java library as well, like for example, a new vulnerabilities come out of in a parsing language, parsing library, and you want to see, okay, across my organization, which repositories are affected. You'll be able to commit it to this repository, and then any application that is consuming this repository of queries can then use those on top of it as well. So you can get some really big, powerful use cases with this as well. And of course, because it's all in repositories, it's all based in Git. So it's all source controlled. You and you can see different versions, and you can see it iterating over time, a particular security issue and things as well. So let me see if there's anything in the chat. How can I graphically visualize CodeQL alerts? Is there any API to grab CodeQL code scanning results? So yes. So right now you can. The only way currently, but this will change in the future, is I'm in the wrong repository. Is actually the only way you can view them primarily is through the user interface in GitHub. Now, if this is not, if you want to, for example, show this as graphs and things like this. This will actually be coming at some point in the future with our tool called Security Center. But we'll talk about that another day. But the other thing that you can do, and I've seen a few customers do this, is actually there's an API that you can use, and Peter's thankfully shared it in the chat, where you can actually just call the API, obtain the results. I can just open it right now just to kind of give you all a quick glance. Oh, why is that not copying? And pasting that in here. And you can kind of see that you can actually pull all the different alerts from CodeQL. Another side point as well about this is this is not just around CodeQL. If you're using, for example, for Ruby, if you're using something like Brakeman or RubyCop or something like this as a third-party add-on, you can actually pull those alerts for this as well. And this will give you some details around like the state of the security issue, the time of discovery, the rule itself, which is and its description, the tool that found it with its exact version as well, and other details. And I've seen some organizations actually pipe this into a graphing dashboard, such as like Kibana or like an elk stack or something like this, and then essentially make a nice pretty dashboard that actually shows you over time graphing and stuff. But this will come native to GitHub at some point as well. Any other questions? Let me grab that a couple of things that I think would be really interesting for everybody. If you're not familiar with how to write CodeQL, or you're a bit interested in how to write the rules, I'll share a couple of links to some YouTube videos of some of my colleagues who are actually did this about 4 months ago as well. So if you're all interested, you can take a look at this. Let me post those in the chat. And they're great. Any questions? No? Awesome. Well, I'll be sticking around a little bit after the stream just to see if anybody's got any questions. But if you have any questions that come to you afterwards, feel free to just tweet me on Twitter or something like this, and I'm happy to take a look at your question and respond to you as well on there. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great day.